Hello, hello, hello. Is this thing on? Is this thing on? Hello. How are we today? Four minutes until we begin. 4 minutes. Check, 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 check-a-doodle-doo, check-a-doodle-doo. Audio check. How are we today? Is everybody in? Is everybody in? The ceremony is about to begin. I've got my coffee. Hello, everybody. Let's check up audio levels. Audio levels. My levels look good. How are we doing? Can you guys hear me? Can you hear me? I see my audio level check on my monitoring screen. So I know that went out over the feed, but Terry says she can hear me. Well, if Terry can hear me, we're good then. As long as Terry can hear me, that's all that matters. Reggie. Hello, Reg. Reggie, Jeremy Terrier. 2 minutes until liftoff. I have coffee. All is well. Coffee, coffee, coffee. Yeah, yeah. Drinking my coffee. I drive my whole family nuts, by the way, because like half the day, if I'm in a good mood, I actually like sing half the things I say while I'm working, and it's so stupid. But it's just goofy. You know, I'll be sitting around and be like, just drawing some characters, da, 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 da. And I'll be sitting there, you know, just making little stupid noises, and it drives them nuts. They're like, God, Dad, would you stop it? You sound stupid. Like, but I'm happy. Oh. 1 minute until liftoff. Oh, I should run and grab my nasal spray before we do this, so that I can actually breathe. Woo-hoo. You might hear Mr. Heisenberg and Mr. Toki in the distance. All right, it is 5 o'clock and time to begin another artist development seminar for CGBytes. As always, I am Les Garner from 6S1 here as your illustrious or dastardly host, however that may be. I have coffee in hand and I'm not afraid to use it. Have ourselves a little cadre of folks joining us as we do each week. So shout outs to everyone. Mr. Jeremy Terrier, Miss V, of course Terry and Loki as always, Reggie Hicks, find Mr. Reggie, Nick Silver with us in the chat. Let's see. We have the post there for the last free product there, the latest free product. Oh, cool. The bundled up tentacle from last week was kind of the impromptu thing that happened from our our little pickup session, kind of answering questions and seeing what we sling on the fly, answering questions that folks may have. It was a fun week. I'm glad to have everybody there for that. All right. So this week we are dipping into the Mecha, I can't even speak right now, Mecha Soccer League concept that was sort of a thing that kind of blossomed out of the chat during the whole All-Terrain Walker series where we were building that mech. If you do not have the mech yet, I suggest going and grabbing that because I'm personally rather proud of that. It was a fun figure to make and renders great, fun to play with, just some cool stuff. So this week I'm going to work on building up some textures that will be team concepts for the All-Terrain Walker, for this Mecha Soccer League concept. And I've already kind of built those in, so I have a copy of those that are in the mech if you download it. So we have something in place for that already that's kind of cool. And where did that go? So let's just go ahead and start things off loading up a copy of the All-Terrain Walker. And here's our fun little vehicle setup here. Okay. And I'm going to do all of the texturing on this, all of this texture development inside Algorithmic Substance Painter. I feel like we could probably spend a lot more time on using the Substance Suite because that whole suite is so powerful for texturing. It has some issues when it comes to texturing characters, mostly in the sense that it doesn't work across UDIM tiles, but other than that, it's incredibly powerful. So that's what I want to focus on for this week's show. We're going to be taking the mech into Substance Painter and building up some texture sets and just kind of exploring different approaches to that, different workflow for what goes on inside there. So once we have our figure loaded up, I'm going to export a copy of that. And just going to go into my Mecha folder. And here I have one already exported, but we'll just overwrite that. So there's the ATW. And I don't want to collect any maps with that export. I just want to write the material library and then leave all of this as is. And we'll give that a moment to export. Now let's pop over to Substance. And I'm going to start a new Substance Painter project. And we're going to use the default PBR metallic roughness, but I'll probably end up changing out the template before I save the textures out when we're done with this. So just so you know, for now, this really doesn't even matter that much. We want to go to Mesh right now. Right now it says no mesh selected, so we'll select our mesh, and we need to navigate to where we'll find that. So here we have our ATW. And then any existing textures that we want to use as resources, anything that's not loaded into Substance by default, we can go ahead and load a lot of that stuff right now. And when you load it at this point in the process, it will tuck that stuff under a project folder so it becomes easier to find inside your overall Substance workflow. Let's just hit add, And then navigate to where I have all the textures. And I'm going to work from my yellow textures, I think. And I'm really not interested in dealing with the interior. I just want to do a new texture treatment for the legs, engine, hull, and cockpit door, you know, the actual hatch. So let's make this a little larger so we can see everything we have here. So here is the engine. Okay, so we want the engine elements. And then the hatch elements. And the legs. Main hull elements. All of those interior elements we can leave out. They really don't matter right now. We'll end up just hiding those. So let's hit open. And now OK. And it's going to bring in our model. Compile that into the scene, and then we should be able to go into our shelves, which I have a sub-shelf pulled out here. And if I type in the little search field project, then that will cull everything out except what we loaded to start this project. A bit of a recap, if you're working in Substance, to navigate that viewport with your mouse without having to use any kind of gizmos or anything, which there really aren't a whole lot of those. They kind of expect you to work with the keys. So you're going to hold the Alt key, click and drag to rotate, and Alt key middle mouse will pan left and right and up and down, and then Alt key right click will zoom. Now, just so you know, there has been, as there often are, on almost a monthly basis, there's been an update to Substance Painter. They update their software constantly, which kind of adds value to the whole subscription concept for how you buy it. That being said, there are a couple of things, really just one thing right off the top that I want to show you that I'm so happy about. So glad they did this. In the past, working with Substance, when you would output your textures, everything was based from these texture sets, which it still is. But the texture sets would come in and always be named, as you see them here, based on numbers of UDIM tiles. So we've talked about UDIM, UDIM, in some depth in the past. Those UDIM tiles are numbered according to columns and rows. Okay, so everything here, these are all on the first row of our UDIM space because they start with a 1. And then 001 is your first tile, second tile, third, and so on. And if you had things that were on the second row of UDIM, then it would be 2000 and something, third row, 2000, and so on. So the first number here is the row, and then everything else is the column of the UDIM space that you're falling in. Anything you bring into Substance comes in with those UDIM numbers. Now, the feature they've added is, thankfully, we can double-click and change those and actually give them proper names. So let's call this one Hull, and then we'll hide it. And then this one we're going to call Hatch. And then Legs. And this one is going to be Interior. This is engine. And then the last one is console. So now, thankfully, finally, we can have proper names on all of these. I can't tell you how frustrating it would get sometimes to have to try and work with those with just numbers there and not being able to change them. You guys have to forgive me. I have no one around to watch Mr. Heisenberg today, so he's sort of on guard doing his duty. You might hear him kind of perk up every once in a while if something catches his attention. Wonderful dog. I love him. He's half husky and half shepherd, and sometimes that shepherd side comes out and he decides to make his presence known. Over the chat, Brent asked, is the tentacles from last week available as a freebie? Yes, it is, Brent. The freebie link was shared just a couple minutes before you showed up. And I think it's just, might be able to grab that. I'm just going to paste that back in here. Oh wait, no, that was for the Mac. Here. And there's the tentacle. I'll just repasting those so that they're there. Right. So now that we have all of these elements named, okay, we can turn off anything that we don't need just to make it lighter on our work inside our viewport so that things update a little faster. We don't even really need to work with the engine because we're going to keep the default texture setups on that. So we want the hull, the legs, and the hatch. Okay. So hull, legs, and hatch are all that we really need showing. So let's start off working with the hull. And we're going to do some basic prep work here, where by default we have an empty channel for painting that loads up in Substance. I'm going to delete that channel, and then we're going to replace it with a fill layer. And fill layers are a little different than paint layers. Paint layers, you can paint directly into them. Fill layers, you can't paint directly into them as is. There is a way that you can paint into them, but it's kind of a sidestep. So we're going to start off with a fill layer, and then we're going to add into that fill layer. Let's make these larger so I can see exactly the names on them, or see the names a little better. Sometimes if your file names are a little bit long, like mine are right here, you can always right-click on an image if you want to see exactly what it is, and it'll tell you things about it, including the name. So I believe here we have main hull. So I'm going to drag that main hull color map over onto my base color, and whenever we start a new fill layer, the UV scaling on it is immediately set to 3. We want to change that to 1 so that our UV space is not tiling. That way our maps fit right into the UVs where they should. Okay, so we drop that into place, and I actually see a small issue here. I added a set of hydraulics into this model kind of late in development, if you recall, and those load on because this is actually a scene subset that loads in so that those all load in together. So I need to re-output my OBJ without those, because right now those are in the same UDIM space as my hull. So let's go over to our scene, and we'll just go down here to the hatch hinges, and I'm going to hide those and re-output this OBJ. And this is a really handy thing to see in action about Substance. So here we have something where the UVs conflict with another UDIM tile. So we can output the OBJ and now just come into our project configuration and we'll reload the OBJ now. So now that should come in. It should retain all of our naming. Everything that we've done so far will be correct. But now we won't have that extra mesh in there that was going to conflict. The problem with having that in there is that when we went to bake out our textures, the program would not be able to discern between the UVs for those and the UVs for the actual hull. It would see them all as being the same object because they're in the same UDIM tile. And so it would translate how that texture plays into those UV spaces and try to split the difference between them, and you get some crazy artifacts and weird stuff going on. It's really kind of garbage when that happens, and it's very frustrating if it happens and you didn't catch it. So, but one of the nice things about Substance Painter is that if that particular problem arises in the course of your work, you can always go back and re-output an OBJ. Sometimes if I have elements like that I want to keep them in the OBJ, but I realize that I made them and maybe didn't move their UDIM tile so that they could tile out with everything else and all that kind of stuff. Sometimes I'll just output those, open it in Maya or some other program that I can edit UVs in, and just grab everything for that UDIM tile and move it. So, and then re-import the object. And again, it will update everything. So even if you make that mistake and you miss it, and you put some time in, some work in, you've developed a bunch of textures, blah, 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 you're getting along really well, and you're really happy with what you got, and then you open it up, and you're like, oh, man, I have overlapping UVs and UDIM tile problems and all that. It's beautiful because it's not that big a deal. You can just re-output your OBJ, bring it back in, you're good. So it's a very, very handy thing, the way that they did that. And I think they sort of understand how kind of harebrained we artists can be sometimes with that sort of thing. You know, especially you get in the creative mood, you get in that point where you're like, oh yeah, I'm going to do this and this and this. You're more concerned about what you're creating than you are the process. And it's nice to not be so bound by process. You know, if there's a mistake, you can step back and it's non-destructive, and so that's a super cool thing. So let's go ahead and add the rest of our image maps into this setup. Okay. So we need to grab our height map and drop that in. And then our normal map. And those two are so crucial, especially the normal map. Your normal maps hold so much of that detail. There's so many things that those do for you. I cannot stress them enough. So then we have our metallicity, which is also, especially in something like this, really, really handy. And then roughness. So that's going to get us back to basically what we ended up with when we first painted the textures for this mech. Once you have all of that, let's name the layer for that setup, and we'll just call that default setup. And then I'm going to just click on this. I can see here the little blue highlight around it, so it is selected, and hit Control C, and that will copy that layer, that whole setup. Now let's switch over to the legs and delete the empty layer they have, and hit Control V, and that pastes that setup that default setup layer in there. Now, of course, it has the wrong images. It still has the hull images, but this gives us a nice fill layer that's already set up with everything in place. So then we just replace the images and we're good to go. So let's drop in the legs color, height, roughness, metallicity, and normal. Okay. Then we need the hatch. And so we'll paste that setup. And again, we're going to drag the color map into place. Then our height map. Then metallicity. And there's roughness and normal. And we also need to add opacity. I like to have it just so we can see it in here. And if you wanted to paint with it, you know, it's nice to have that in place. So let's go to our texture set, and we're going to hit the plus sign right here out from channels, and we will go to opacity. And so now you'll see opacity appears right here. And so we turn that on, we get a new channel, it shows up down here. And where we have an opacity map, we can just drag that into place. We'll give that just a moment. Now, you're not going to see the effects of that opacity yet because we have a shader, the default shader in Substance doesn't pay attention to opacity at all. Right now, the default shader that loads in is PBR Metal Rough. So we want to switch that from PBR Metal Rough to PBR Metal with alpha blending. But once we have that with alpha blending, then you can see we have control over being able to actually see our opacity's effect. Okay. Now, I don't necessarily have to go through and set up the rest of my shaders, but I'm going to, simply because for the sake of art development, I find it would be a little awkward to just paint on these and not see how it's going to interact with the other stuff. So let's go ahead and go to our console, and I'm going to solo that. And one of the other opportunities we have here is for you to see how, if you neglected to bring in some textures and assets that you might want at the point where you created your project, we can do that anytime by going to File, Import Resources, and then we'll hit Add Resources. And I'll just navigate out to where the rest of my textures are. So let's grab the rest of these guys right here. So once I bring those in, I need to tell it where to place them. So I'll just type project once, and then copy that and paste it into each of these. Then we also need to tell Substance what each one of these will be recognized as. So each one is going to be a texture. And we're going to tell it to import those resources into this project. So now we hit import, and you'll see our project over here updates with all of those. So now on our console, I will delete that channel and then go back to my engine, the hull, copy, And now back on my console, I'm going to paste that material. And go through and replace all of our images. So there we have that. We could also add an emission channel if we really wanted, so that we could see the glow from everything there in the readout screens. But I think right now that would be a bit excessive. So next, let's go to our interior. And same process, delete the default channel, paste what we had, and start replacing. All right. Now we can turn everything back on. And it looks like we still have the engine to go. So let's go ahead and do the engine. And inside DS, I actually made a slight change. I decided that I wanted to take a number of parts of that engine and make it darker. So it's not exactly the same inside here as it is inside DS, because I did pull some little things with the shader inside there to make that engine a little more delineated from everything else, make it a little darker. I think I may have actually taken it all the way to black. I haven't looked at this in a bit, so that's quite possible. But if we wanted to do that, that gives us an opportunity here to look at some interesting things that we can do with ID maps and things like that. So I do want to go take a look. I think that I have an ID map created for this. Cockpit, console, engine. There we go. Cool. Yeah, we have an engine ID map. So let's go bring that asset into Substance. So we'll go to Import Resources, Add Resources. And we want our engine ID. I have two of these because sometimes when you're outputting things from Zbrush, you can end up having them flipped upside down. So you can see that my TIFF is reversed for my JPEG. And let's just make sure. Actually, I think I'm going to want the TIFF one. Yeah, the TIFF one's the one that's aligned properly. So let's grab that. We'll open it. We're going to put that in Project. It's a texture. There we go. Bring that in. And there we have our engine ID map. And for those who may not have been with us for some of our past little excursions into Substance, an ID map is kind of like in, if we were to look inside DAZ Studio, let me give you something a little more analogous so that you can see what an ID map is really doing. Okay, if we were to go into DAZ Studio and select our hull, and then we go to our geometry editor, and look here under surfaces, okay? In the geometry editor in DAZ Studio, you're going to see a listing for every different surface that you can have shaders applied to. Of course, they also show up over here under your surfaces in the surfaces tab where you would apply those shaders. Each one of those surfaces can be considered an identifier that tells the program, you know, on these polygons we have a material. On these polygons we have another material. Well, what we'll do is take the model into another program where we can look at the UVs, or we can flood UVs. You can actually paint ID maps right inside Substance as well, which is kind of neat. I like to use Zbrush for this because in Zbrush I can tell it to regroup the model based on UV shells, and then I let those UV shells generate color that become ID maps or identifiers, and I'll save that out as an ID map. So what we end up with is a map that looks kind of like this, where we have colors for all these different sections. And of course we could go in and paint those, so if there are 2 or 3 different sections where we know we want those to, you know, say we had sections for different elements like these little tiny shapes that you can see right here. Let's take that large, it's as large as it goes. Okay, where you can see the tiny little shapes there underneath those 2 large green shapes at the top. Those small shapes are the UV shells for each of these little lights. So we could, if we wanted all of those to have the same identifier, we could just make sure that all of that area has the same color. As long as we have an ID map like this, we can come into our texture set settings and drag and drop that right here where it says ID map. And once you have something in there for an ID map, that then means that anytime we use masking or any effects that call on an ID map, it knows that this is our default ID map. Now you could pick different ID maps later, and there are lots of advanced ways to use that. So you could have different identification maps that you've developed that overlay for different things and give you different effects. Most of the time you're just going to have one, and we'll just, if you only have the one ID map, we'll drop that in right here, and that gives us that immediate access to being able to isolate different sections of the model for different types of texturing, for guiding different types of materials. So one of the things that I like about physics-based materials is that with PBRs, everything's driven by maps. And since they're driven by maps, that means that you're not bound by hard edges. For instance, if we're over in DAZ Studio and we just have flat colors on something, and we want to have 2 different materials on a surface, those materials are always going to have a hard edge where they meet, because they're going to be assigned by polygons, and of course polygons are bound by edges. So if we have ID maps, instead of having to assign materials per polygon, the materials are assigned by maps, and those maps can then have painted blending. They can fade in and out of each other and all kinds of cool stuff like that. So it really opens us up in a lot of really handy, cool ways. So let's go ahead and make a couple of color tweaks to our engine since we're in here right now. And I'm also going to bump up my resolution in viewport to 2048. Actually, let's take it all the way up. Let's take it to 4096 and see what we get. Okay, so there you can see what our default maps look like on that. So now let's just come in with a new fill layer. And with that fill layer, the only thing I want to affect is color. So we'll turn off each of these channels. Now we're only affecting color. Then the other thing that I want to do is have that color become almost pure black, like so. And now I'm going to show you how that ID map plays into being able to let those other painted parts come through that we want. So now if we were to click on this little emblem right here for masking, we can add a mask with color selection. As soon as you add that, the effects of your layer disappear because it's waiting for you to tell it what to become visible and for you to pick that based on colors in an existing identification map. So let's go into our color selection here, which is the little menu that comes up in our properties that happens whenever we bring up that color selection. And we'll pick color, and then it'll temporarily switch your view over to show a view of your ID map on the model. So let's pick our green ID map, and then if we hit pick color again, we can pick more colors and add them to the list of colors that get masking or become visible, I should say, from our ID map. Okay. And sometimes you'll see some little artifacting, little edges here. And so to get rid of that, we can turn up our tolerance. And essentially what that is doing is acting very much like a selection command would in Photoshop. So here, if we turn up that tolerance though, we start to lose some of our colors and things that we want in some of these other areas. So let's add another pick. Sometimes you have to zoom in and get very, very tight with that. Okay. And then to tighten that up the rest of the way, we'll right click again over on color selection, and now we're going to add paint. And then let's turn on symmetry with this guy right here, and I always turn off the symmetry plane because I really don't want to see that. So now if we paint on here, we're painting into the mask, so we can either add to the mask or take away from it. Let's go to our color and we'll flip that. So now we can just kind of hone the rest of that mask a little bit. Okay. And so there we have a quick means of changing out the color or any aspect of texturing across a model just based on identifiers that we pre-painted somewhere else. Very, very handy system. Now let's turn on everything, and we should have a representation here that's much closer to what we have over in DS. Let's turn on iRay for a minute just to compare. Give that just a moment. These are some large textures, and it takes it a minute to load those into memory. While that is baking, I'm going to take a quick look over at the chat and see if anyone has any questions or comments so far. So I might want to darken up this texture over here just to make it a little closer to what we have. So let's just go into our color for that. We'll tighten that up. And I also want to tighten up some of that specularity that you see so that we're kind of working a little more in line with what we have over in DS. So I'll go back down to my original layer here because our fill layer is only affecting color. Turn that height back off on. There we go. One of the things that I really like about Substance is how much it's like working in Photoshop in a lot of ways. The layer system in here is very similar to Photoshop, but imagine if you're in Photoshop and the layer you're looking at is just diffuse or is just one thing. Whereas in Substance, you have all these different channels represented with your layers. So every time you're on a layer, everything that you look at, you're seeing 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 different channels of data represented at the same time for that layer. And at any point, we can switch over and start editing aspects of our material very directly. So for instance, we could switch right now and alter our roughness without altering the color at all. And let's just do that. Let's switch over to roughness. And then here in our default setup, I will right click and let's add a levels command, okay? And I'm going to, in that levels command, you'll see it has a little entry here that says affected channel. I'm going to click on that and go to roughness. And now, as I change that, say if I move its midpoint to the left, it becomes much more muted. Or if I go to the right, it's going to become much shinier. Okay. Now let's look at our metallicity and let's add another levels command. And this one we're going to drive metallic. And here you can see that it changes the name on each of these commands, so you know, looking right here in the layer stack, which channel you're going to be operating on. Okay. I wanted to make sure I took a little bit of time to demonstrate that because it's something that I think is incredibly handy. I mean, that is such a powerful way of fine-tuning your textures and shaders inside Substance. It's one of the things that I think makes Substance just such an amazing tool for folks, especially folks working with Daz Studio, because iRay is a physics-based engine. And so having the ability to edit those channels like that and see results from them in real time, it's so powerful. Now, another thing that I like to do that we haven't done yet, and I do this almost immediately when I'm prepping a mesh for work inside Substance. And just for the record, of course, since you guys have already seen this model painted in Substance before, obviously I already have a setup for this, but I wanted to take a moment, take a little bit of time today and show you guys, kind of walk back through the steps of doing a setup like this in Substance so that you understand. Because you know, the setup can vary, and then of course, you know, now we have the ability to change the names and all that kind of stuff. So it's something that I think always bears repeating, is like, this is how you set your stuff up. So the next thing that I'm going to do, and something that I always do before I ever start actually doing any painting in here, is bake all the other maps that Substance likes to have and look at for all the different kinds of effects and things that it can use. So here in my texture set settings, I'll go to Bake Textures, and I'm going to set my output size of all these to 4096. I don't need it to bake ID maps And since I actually have an ID map in one of these already, I definitely don't want it to bake those. And I don't need it to bake normal maps because I've already brought in normals from Zbrush. We're going to bake out our world space normal, ambient occlusion, curvature, position, and thickness now. Okay. So let's hit bake all textures and give that a moment. And while that runs, I will, as is customary, take a look over the chat. If anyone has any questions or comments so far, please let me know. This can take a couple of moments, so this is a good time. If you guys have anything you'd like to talk about or ask about, this is definitely a good time to do that. And Mr. Muhammad Ayman, you are very much welcome. Glad you're liking the tutorials. Glad you're digging the stuff. Muhammad asks, is DAZ Studio enough for rendering? I would say yes. DAZ Studio can render like a total beast. iRay is just amazing. Says I discovered a lot of art on the website. On the CGBytes site? I'm going to guess and say on the CGBytes site. There's a lot of great artwork on there. And while you're looking around at that stuff, Mr. 3D Loki, Jason, kind of curates sort of a pick of the litter, if you will, and shares. Oh, cool. Yeah, definitely talking about that site. Yeah, Jason shares a lot of artwork from the site, kind of stuff that he picks out to highlight. Shares that stuff across social media on a pretty regular basis, and you see, like if you're following us on following CGBytes on Facebook, you'll see a lot from him through that. A lot of artwork shared through that. That's just really cool stuff. Yeah, if you're just getting started, you're just looking at this stuff and want to get into it, I would encourage you to go download DAZ Studio. It's free, and even though the other programs and things that I'm using here and kind of demonstrating with are obviously, they're obviously not free. The Substance Suite from Algorithmic, I feel, is probably the best bang for your buck you're going to find when it comes to texturing software. The deal with them is you can get all of their programs and you pay for it monthly. It's a monthly subscription setup. And their $20 a month gives you Bitmap to Material, Substance Designer, and Substance Painter. And the three of those together have become staples throughout the gaming and film industries. I work on stuff outside of the 3D content world with DAZ and all that. And in those other sectors of 3D, everything that we use here on this, it all applies in those areas. So one of the things that I try to focus on too, or at least maybe focus is a strong word, maybe I try to allude to and make sure you guys are all aware of, is that most, if not all, of the things that I've been teaching you in this ongoing series have been skills that apply directly to the broader 3D markets, the broader 3D industries of gaming, film, animation, VR development, all that kind of stuff. Almost everything that we do in here that you've seen each week along this series relates directly into the broader world of 3D, and something that I have wondered about for a while, and really want to encourage people to do. Daz Studio and Poser, you know, kind of its sort of older cousin, or older sibling. Daz Studio and Poser, while viewed by a lot of people as hobby programs, programs for hobbyists, they can teach you a lot. You can learn a lot about 3D, and those become really, really strong gateways to building a career. You know, if you are looking at 3D and you're interested in kind of taking the baby steps to really getting your head around 3D as an art form, then I highly recommend Poser and Daz Studio both. They also, the two programs, they have enough in common that they're very analogous to each other, and they have just enough different that I would say it's good. Even though Poser is not free, it's still good to try and use both of them at some point, because there's things that you'll pick up out of both that actually relate to other more quote-unquote high-end programs when you get there. As anyone who watches any of these videos will know, I am a huge advocate, huge fan of and user of Maya, and specifically moving into the high-end world. I would say that in terms of modeling, shaders, rigging, all of those aspects of what you'll find in Daz Studio, one of the things that I love about Daz Studio is that I would say it is about 75 to 80% analogous to everything that I do inside Maya. Like, there is a lot of overlap in the tools, the techniques, the capabilities between those two programs. I mean, there are a few, well, I shouldn't say a few. There's a lot of things that you get into with the higher end software like Maya that you're not going to have in DS, but that's okay. Because when you start out with DS, you know, you learn the rigging there. If you learn how to rig in DS, then when the time comes that you go to step up to, you know, Maya or Modo, Max, Cinema 4D, I'm not a big Lightwave fan, but we'll leave that out of this. If you start with DS, at the time when the time comes that you go to move up to something like a Maya or a Max or a Modo, you're going to find a lot of familiarity, a lot of very familiar concepts and tools, and that's one of the reasons that I have tried, as I do these things too, to teach in a very conceptual manner. So I try to give you guys a lot of the ideas and the fundamental concepts behind the things that you see, because it's my hope that what I'm showing you, even though we're starting out in this kind of, you know, this hobby world, it's my hope that you guys will take it and really move forward with it. Take those skills and let them become something more. Push deeper, okay? Go read some things about the higher end software. Look up Unreal, you know, UDK, Unreal Developers Kit, and Unity. Look at those game engines. It's amazing how much this stuff translates. Mohammed asks if I'm planning on doing any animation tutorials in Daz. Planning to, yeah. I would like to. I would really like to. On the back end of this stuff, it's always hard sometimes because there's a lot of things that, you know, that sometimes you can't really talk about up front. Different announcements and things that you need to make one time or another. So there's a lot of things that are hard for me to say at this point. But I would absolutely love to do some teaching on animating in DS, because animating in DS is just really powerful. It's very different than animating in Poser too, and there's actually some things about Poser that I really love for animation, whereas in Poser, and the guys at Daz, man, I talk to the folks at Daz on a pretty regular basis, and some guys who are kind of pretty deep behind the scenes there, and I think they're probably getting tired of hearing like, oh, it's less again. Yeah, he's going to say something about function curves. He's going to say something about function curves and graph editors. Why don't we have those? Yeah, it's true. Daz Studio does not natively have a function curve or a graph editor, and it makes me very angry. And once you get into animation, you'll find out what those things are, and then you'll want to kick somebody for them not having that in the software. Those things should be there. Dang it, they should be there. Daz Studio, you should absolutely have a function editor. I'm actually going to switch back over to DS for a minute and turn off iRay so that it speeds some things up over here. But I can show you really quickly kind of the gist of animating in here, though, because in DS animation is pretty easy. And with this mech, I did include some animated poses. So like if we apply an animated pose, let's apply a walk. Okay, let's leave those on. And so boom, 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 boom. And yes, again, I make stupid mouth noises all the time. I'll be sitting here animating and be like, making doom, doom, goofy, stupid noises because basically I get paid to still be a 15-year-old kid. But essentially the way animation is going to work in like any program is setting a keyframe where you have a change in a parameter. That's really all it ever is a parameter changes at a key. So here we have, if we hit currently used, I can see the only parameter changing on this leg piece right here, this leg top, is the bend, okay? And that's just a rotation control. And so at different keys, different frames, that's changing, along with a ton of other parameters across the figure to alter its pose at that point in time. That's really the most fundamental, basic level concept of animating that I could give you in a quick sort of way. Animation is very much an art form unto itself, and it actually makes me very sad that in the course of this hobby market and the hobby industry around DS and Poser that we don't see more animating. Both of them are crazy kinds of powerful for that, and yet people just want to do still images. And I'm like, guys, come on, you've got the tools here. It always reminds me of this quote from George Lucas, who, love him or hate him, he's one of my heroes regardless of his own flaws. Nobody's perfect, but it always makes me think of this one quote I remember hearing from George Lucas, and it's one of the things I heard him say in an interview back in the 90s that helped inspire me to really get serious about doing this stuff. And it's probably around 1994 that I think he said this, 4 or 5, when they were talking about the Star Wars re-releases that were coming out at the time. And he said, it was in an interview, and they were asking him about the technology and the computer technology. And they're like, oh my God, computers, because this was the early 90s, and everybody's like, oh, computers. And the interviewer said to him, what is your prediction for the future with technology? And George Lucas said, I believe the next Star Wars, we're speaking metaphorically, he said, I believe the next Star Wars will probably be made in someone's bedroom on a personal computer. Now, that was 1994, and here we are in 2017. Let that sink in. 1994, so 2004, 2014, 23 years. It's probably 94, somewhere between 94 and 96. He said that. So 20-ish, 23 to 26 years, 20-ish years later, 20-ish years later, here we are. And of course, there's always a naysayer, and I know who that naysayer is always going to be. It says, you need to render 30 plus images per 1 second video, and the standard one's there, 1920 with 1080. It takes far too long for the average person to animate. Actually, it doesn't, because you can peel your render settings down and get them to go quickly. And when you think about the amount of power that we have, even with you can buy a video card now that is 2 years, 3 years old, and use that video card for rendering, do rendering real time, or even better, animate the stuff inside DS or Poser, export animated FBXs, and take those things into Unity or Unreal, and both of those can do photorealistic real-time rendering, which is another beef I have with both Poser and DAZ Studio. It's like, why haven't you guys, why don't we have that in here? That should be in here. If free game engines have it, it should be in both these programs. But my point is not to say, well, anybody can do it. I mean, it is sort of to say that anybody can do it. But what this does, we have animation brought down to the baseline consumer level now with free programs like DAZ Studio and Blender and things like that. So and it's wide open, and it's always bothered me. It's bothered me for a long time that there isn't more attempts at animation going on, or at least being shared and talked about. I feel like there's a lot of lost opportunities out there for people to make that next Star Wars in their bedroom, by not animating. So anyway, all that really just to answer, Muhammad's question there, about animating. Yeah, you can totally animate inside here. You can do a lot of powerful, crazy stuff. I think actually I want to show you just a quick sample before we go into our break. Let's go into my promos and let's see, CGB Mecha. And I'm going to pull this up and play it on screen. Hopefully it'll work out all right. Here we have one of these guys. Here's a much longer piece. So here's an army of mechs marching off, using an HDRI image as the background, and they interact with the ground really well. They're instanced throughout, so even though there's a ton of them there, the render time was really, really fast on these. I'm not using a really heavy-duty machine to do this stuff at all, folks. So, I mean, right there you go. You get a 2-second clip that is, that's some crazy stuff compared to what we had 20 years ago. But yeah. It always kills me where I'll get some pushback on the whole animation thing with these, because I mean, I've used DAZ and Poser both for animation for a long time, and I know from production experience that you can really do some crazy stuff with them. So it's just a matter of working with them and figuring out the tools. What's funny is I actually prefer. There's certain things I prefer quite a bit about animating inside Poser than I do DAZ Studio. Mostly that you have that function curve editor, but yeah, it is very viable. You're always going to run into some naysayers, Muhammad, about that. But I will tell you from massive amounts of experience, you can do some crazy amounts of animation in these. So I would encourage you to explore that. So. Just looking at the time, it is 6:05, and usually an hour in, we take a little break for a couple of minutes so that I can kind of get a drink, reset a little bit, and kind of prep for a moment to go into our second hour. So at this point, I do believe, yes, everything is baked that we wanted baked. And you should notice that it looks a little different now, too, because we're going to have things like ambient occlusion and things like that showing up. And here, under our texture set settings, you can see those maps showing up in the list. And so that's kind of a cool thing to have there, because those maps will guide and drive a lot of different effects and things that we can use inside Substance. So now that's all finished, I'm going to take a short break, grab a quick drink, and when I come back, we're going to get into finishing out the painting on this. I know the actual texture setup on this kind of stuff can seem like it takes a while, but as with so many things in doing this kind of artwork, the preparation is incredibly important. And the more prepared you are and the more prep work you do, the better, more informed prep work you do, the easier things go. And then once you have those things prepared, if you have a model that you plan to do a lot of different textures and things for, you know, having that prep work done and going through that process means that you can save your project and not have to do it again. So anyway, with all that said, I'm going to take a short break as is customary, and we shall be right back. Okay, got my coffee, and I am back. Let's dig into to painting these babies out. So I'm going to go back into my display settings, excuse me, my texture set settings for a moment, and change that resolution on them back down to 2048, because that's going to be, actually I might even go down further. Let's go down to 1024 so that that can run much faster. And we get better interactivity with that inside our viewport. Now let's look at our hull. I'm going to solo that hull out. And let's bring in some more of those ID maps. Okay, let's go to File, Import Resources, Add Resource. And let's just bring in the rest of these. And we're going to place those in our project. We'll hit import. Okay. And there we have those IDs. So now let's place this ID map on our hull. And then we should have an ID map in here for the legs. Yes, let's go ahead and put an ID map on the legs. And then the hatch. There we go. And the reason I wanted to bring in those ID maps is so that we can paint out the damaged paint that is our default on here. Okay, and we can paint that out and replace it much easier with an ID map than if we were just going to paint over it by hand. So now let's go back over to our shelves, and I'm going to go to my materials. Actually, let's go to our smart materials. And let's make these large so we can see. And let's just pick something, some type of metal that seems appropriate here. Let's do a quick search for steel. Okay. So here we have a lot of different types of steel material. And I'm going to drag one of these. Let's use just normal steel. I'm going to drag a copy of that. Just drag and drop it right on top of our existing layer. Of course, that's going to overwrite everything in that layer that you can see right there for the moment. It's going to replace all of it. So once we have that, if we click on our masking button and then we add mask with color selection, now we can go in and choose what is going to be replaced. Okay. So there, we just replaced all of that yellow because I had that set up as a section of my ID map. So we just replaced all of that. And now we could go inside that smart material and edit any number of different aspects. Let's say we wanted to paint out some of the sort of aging and damage that we have in here right now. Most of that is coming through in the normal map. So let's go down to our default setup layer and add paint. And then let's set that. Excuse me. Let's kill that. Let's go to our normal and then add paint. And then in our paint settings, I'm going to turn off everything except the normal channel. And then here in the paint layer, the little addendum of paint to the layer, we're going to set that to normal. And so now you can see we're able to paint right over those rough spots and smooth those back out. Okay. Let's also just turn our base layer color kind of off for a bit. So that we can sort of see a little more clearly what we're doing with that normal map. And then here we can affect a number of things about our brush. There's a lot going on here that is as I've said before, very analogous to Photoshop. Let's paint out some of that. Paint out some of this. And we might also want to have this set up so that we're working on the roughness as well. There we go. And your bracket keys, again, just like in Photoshop, the bracket keys will allow you to very easily increase or decrease your brush size. And I am working with mirroring still turned on. And probably need to paint out some of the metallicity too. There we go. So there you can see how we're actually painting into these different channels all at once. There we go. Just kind of smooth some of that out. And you might see a little bit of texture artifacting in here at the moment. That is going to come from the fact that I do have my texture resolution set for display at the moment to 1024 for the sake of speed. Most, if not all of that, should clear up if we turn that resolution up. Okay. So just paint out some of that. Some of that. Okay. Now I'm going to turn that color back up. Should start seeing a lot more smoothness. Here we go. So now we're kind of back down to more of a bare metal. Just working out some of those blemishes from the original. So if you've bought or downloaded a model from somewhere and you want to retexture it, and let's say you bought something that has kind of some damage and things built into it, not that big of a deal because you can always come into Substance and paint out most, if not all of that. Now let's start altering this color a bit. I would want to go through and use that same sort of methodology to work out, kind of smoothing out some of those rougher details of the legs. Let's drop a copy of that steel on top of here as well. And we will repeat our process for the color masking. And so I want to use that steel on, let's use that on every place that had the yellow painted into it. Okay. And then here I'm going to add paint. And again, we're going to keep color turned off. We're going to paint into everything else there. We do have symmetry turned on. So we also need to make sure, this is something right here that can be a little bit annoying sometimes. You want to make sure that you have, that if you're trying to wipe out some existing surface detail that's coming from normal and height maps, you want to make sure you come in and change their blend mode in your paint edition to normal. And you need to do that, make sure that that's set that way on each of them. Okay, so there you can see now with those set properly, we can come in and interactively work out all of that. If only in real life it were this easy to get rid of rust. My wife's Jeep would be so much less of a drama. So here we can come through and work out all kinds of cool stuff. Just make little improvements. Make something old become new again. Right. Just gonna walk through here, buff all this out. I'm just gonna buff out the dings. Oop. Okay. And while we're in here, I want to show you another feature of Substance that I don't think I've gotten into before. Okay, there are different ways that we can view a model inside here. And one of them that I'm really fond of is where we can do a split 3D and 2D view. Now that 2D view is going to take everything that we see and flatten that out into UV space. And what's interesting though is our symmetry still works inside here. The symmetry is based on 3D space. So the program knows that if I touch something over here, it knows to also touch its counterpart from three-dimensional space, even if the UV space isn't symmetrical. So that's kind of some cool stuff right there. Actually, it's the only program I've seen that actually works in that way. And that I find really, really cool. So let's just do a little bit of painting here. This is going to come into play a little bit more down the line, but like right here in the 2D, okay, here I'm painting in 2D space where I can see it flattened out. And this should be really attractive for folks who are traditional, kind of old school texture painters still working out of Photoshop, because this is gonna look very similar to what you might do with painting textures there over a UV template. So then here we can paint out some of that roughness. Okay. There we go. So now if I come back into a 3D only view, should be much closer to a really smooth surface on here. And this was also a nice opportunity to kind of show you guys that you can work in UV space and 3D space at the same time and be able to see the results. So there's a lot of things that can tell you about your work as you're working. So here we're just going to paint out all of this stuff, smooth that down a bit. Now, let's look at, so we have the hull that we've smoothed out for the most part. Our legs, so the engine's fine. Let's just turn everything on. We need to deal with the hatch. Let's look at the hatch. And the hatch is going to be a great candidate for working in the split 3D, 2D view. Okay, so let's drag a copy of steel on top. And then let's do color selection mask. And we only want that steel on our actual hull. Then let's come down to our default setup, add some paint, and then in our normal, we're going to set that to normal, and then our height, set that to normal. Everything else should be good. And there we go, symmetry is on. So now if I come in here and paint, you can see how that works itself out. And I'm actually going to go over and just make all of this very smooth. Okay. And there you can see kind of with those broad strokes, you can actually see a better representation, I think, of that working in the two different views. Okay. So now we have those three main elements that we're going to be texturing. Let's turn everything back on because I like to see it all together. Now let's go into our hull and let's paint this guy up to be a third team. Right now we've got kind of some intentionally generic red and blue teams with this sort of octagonal soccer theme sort of pattern that I put together on them. Those are there as kind of demo textures. Let's go ahead and paint this guy up with something kind of cool looking. And so we have our basic steel material on top. Let's add another material. Okay. And no. Come back here. Let's go to materials. And let's drag painted steel over here. And with that, you're going to see how we can copy existing masking. It's very handy. So let's right click on the masking icon right there. With copy mask. Now I'll go to painted steel. I'm going to create a black mask. And then right click and go paint or paste into mask. So now that has inherited that same mask. And of course, this is a painted steel. So let's pick a color for this. Let's say a team whose colors are, let's do something dark. I mean, I'm feeling kind of dark today. Let's do something that is black, and then maybe we'll throw some flames on it. I think that'd be kind of cool. So there we've got that black paint in place. And then we can adjust how shiny or dull it is with the paint roughness here. So let's make this a little on the newer side. And then if we wanted to weather it, we could turn up rust on it, but we don't. We want to keep that kind of weathered for now. or keep the weathering down, I should say. Okay. And I still have symmetry turned on, and I want to keep that turned on. So now let's right click on this guy and add paint to our layer. And we're going to alter our brush a bit. So let's make sure that our size is set to follow pen pressure. And this is where I kind of get to have a little bit of fun. I'm a traditional artist by trade anyway, and so I like to do a lot of things that involve just being able to paint. So let's pick nice hot red to start off with. Okay. And of course, with that symmetry on, you can see how that works out. Very handy. Then I'm going to turn on the lazy mouse. And if you're familiar with Zbrush, you've probably played around with lazy mouse a little bit. Lazy mouse is really handy, especially for someone, you know, if you have any kind of shakiness in your hands, you can use a lazy mouse setting to steady out your strokes. So here, that's exactly what I'm going to do. And then let's go into our eraser. And I'm going to turn my hardness up almost all the way with it. And use that to clip my way back to a nice tight point. Now, let's come in here. Not bad, not bad. Okay. Like I said, for me, this is kind of the fun part. There we go. And sometimes I actually prefer working without the lazy mouse, but it's something I wanted to point out because I know for a lot of folks it can be a real lifesaver. Okay. Let's fill that in a bit. Take this on down to here. I kind of like that. And I think I want to switch off to my eraser again and use that to sort of bring some of this in. Of course, you can get as granular with that as you like. let's just finish out this section right here. Pardon me. It's funny too, like the lazy mouse thing is really handy, but you can almost get a similar effect just in how you move your own arm. So if I had a camera set up right now where you could see, I'd show you, but there's a way that I move my arm when I draw. If I want to make a long, smooth stroke like that, I don't actually move my wrist at all. It's entirely, I'll take my hips and pull from the hips, so it's my entire torso gradually pulling my arm along, and it's amazing, and it sounds weird. It sounds really awkward and strange, and I know sometimes if I'm out and about somewhere with a sketchbook and doodling and people see me drawing, sometimes the way that I move when I'm drawing looks really weird, but there's a reason to it, and a lot of that comes in that it helps me steady things out. While we're looking at this, let's turn that resolution up just a touch. And I love that you still have interactivity with the viewport even while it's updating. So handy. It's funny, I think this is starting to show a little bit of my homesickness because I grew up around a lot of guys who were really deep into like building hot rods and stuff like that, kind of old school hot rods too, like real rockabilly looking stuff. And yeah, I always dig the aesthetics of that sort of thing. Let's smooth some of that out just a little bit more. And let's do that using, I want to get a nice clip going down some of this area right here. And we can use our paint polygon tool, okay, or polygon fill. Let's sample our red and get that in place. Actually, we need some black there. There we go. And so that's really nice because then with that tool, we can just select individual polygons and it will fill those with paint. So if we want to get a nice crisp edge going down this body panel, we can do that right like this. Mr. Heisenberg is on the job today. You guys probably hear my goofy dog, one of my goofy dogs. Yes, Heisenberg, we know you're there. Dang it. Sometimes the eyedropper in here can be a little wonky. Let's do a little bit of paint. Sometimes too, polygon fill tool will try to paint all the way through onto other things. So you have to kind of be aware that it might try to do that. Kind of like right there. Did not want it to do that. Pesky, pesky. And if we hit C, we can cycle through and seeing our channels. So I'm actually just going to cycle through to where I can see just in the color channel. That way I can pick that color more truthfully. More of that black in here. There we go. So there's what our flat coloring looks like right now. So now if I right click and go to display material, we can get back to our actual material. Let's save this before we lose it. And I'm just going to call this Mecha Flame Job for the moment. All right. So now that we're saved, or I believe, oh, it's still saving. There you go, saving project. Once it finishes saving the project, I'm going to introduce you guys to another little feature of Substance that I haven't covered before. One of probably, you know, a few dozen, because this thing has a lot of stuff under the hood. It's very cool that way. But we'll introduce you to another feature here that is the Photoshop bridge. Again, this is something that really relates well to folks who are kind of old school painters who use UV templates inside Photoshop and all that. And I think you'll really dig the results. So it's some very cool stuff that can be done there. Just give that a moment to save. Sometimes the project files from Substance can be really, really large. Okay, so let's solo out just the hull. You can see right there our polyfill tool reached through and grabbed some polygons that we really didn't want it to grab. So let's paint some of those guys out. Give ourselves some softness on that. We'll try a little tenderness with it. Yeah, we'll just paint those out. There we go. Okay, so from here, let's hit the big PS button there. I'm going to select none at the moment because I only want my hull. So here's the hull. If we click on the check beside the name, it will select all of the maps inside its material. I only want its base color. So let's hit that and OK. Jeremy Terrier says Heisenberg's uncertainty principle. I don't know who or what that is, so I'll bark anyway. Yes, yes. He is named Heisenberg because he is the one who barks. So, and I hope you guys get the reference. He doesn't have hands, so he doesn't knock. He is not the one who knocks. He is the one who barks. Heisenberg is Rebecca's baby. He is my wife's baby dog. Baby doggy. And boy, does she baby that dog. It's hilarious. So now that we have this over in Photoshop, we can do anything to it that we would normally do inside Photoshop. So I'm going to take that as an opportunity to add some nifty little doodads and accoutrement inside our little flame job here. So let's make a selection with our wand of the color. And then let's add well, let's see. Let's shrink that selection a bit. Modify. And let's contract that by, let's say, 5 pixels. And then let's do a foreground to background gradient in there. And in our background, I'm going to put a nice hot yellow color. There we go. I think I'd rather have that be like this. There we go. All right. Let's save that. And then once that is saved, I will need to send that image. I need to save that image map out so that we can replace our base color currently with this. So let's just save that and let's see. Save it, whole base color PSD. Okay, and I'm going to throw a new fill layer on top. Turn off everything in that except the color. Set our UV scale to 1. And now let's import resource. And where'd that go? Yeah, let's save that out a little differently. I'm not entirely sure why it's not wanting to import that PSD. There we go. Save that as a PNG file. Try that. Ah, never mind. That's why I was in the wrong place. Derp, my bad. Let's save as. Do 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 do. All right. There we go. Okay. And bring that in. Now let's throw that over here onto our base color. So there you can see pretty nifty swifty flame job. Now, once I've re-imported that PSD like that, let's say I want to back up a little bit and redo that gradient. And let's do it. Let's do it like this. Let's copy and paste, and then duplicate that layer. Delete one flame. Delete the other. And now I'm going to apply that gradient per flame. Like that. Now if we save that again, we should be able to go back over to Substance. And another new feature since the latest update is the Resources Updater. Okay. So when you open that, you can type in something here in the search. So I just typed in hull, so it's going to show us every asset that we're reading from somewhere else called hull. And here we have hull base color. So I could select a new resource for that. Okay. We can hit update all, and it should look through everything that we're using. What was that? Okay, that might not be in the right place for what I'm looking for. So let's cancel out of that. If we right click and hit reload though, it should definitely grab that texture again. I'm wondering if it's not seeing a duplicate somewhere. So there we have our flame job. And now let's look at the legs. Okay. And the legs. Let's come over and grab some painted steel. Just drag that out on top. I'm going to copy my color selection mask. I'm having a total brain fart. There's a lot of stuff in these menus sometimes, so there we go. Copy mask. That's what I want. Now let's add a black mask and then paste into mask. Of course, we could also just go over to the hull and grab my painted steel layer and just copy that. Come back to our legs, because this way I know I'm going to have exactly the same settings, and we'll just paste. Of course, it's going to paste in with that masking, so when that comes in, I will just repaste, recopy and paste that mask into this one. So now we have the same material there, and we'll need to replace our paint that we have stacked on top. So let's do that. And we have symmetry turned on. So let's add some fresh paint. And go into my color. And I'm going to select a nice hot red. And let's continue to flame on. And I do need to harden this up a bit. And this time I think I'm just going to do some quick strokes in here. Like that. And a nice thing here is that if we accidentally paint into an area that we don't want, we could always go into that 2D and 3D combined view and tweak that out from there. Okay. There's that. And now let's send that over to Photoshop. So this time let's uncheck our hull, go down to the legs and check the base color, hit OK. Okay. Here we can see where our flames are painted. So let's select these guys right here. And just because of the way the UV splits through where I painted, you may end up having to wrestle with it just a little bit to get exactly what we want. Let's contract that. There we go. Yeah, these right here, I'm thinking we're going to have to fight with a little bit. So let's go ahead and save that. Yeah, by default, it's going to put that stuff under My Documents, you know, whatever your username is, My Documents, Substance Painter 2 Exports. Which is not where I want this to go. Pardon me. There we go. Legs base color PSD. And let's also, just because, let's save that. Legs base color PNG. And then import. Let's grab the PSD. There we go. Texture. Nope. We want project. And texture. And project. Hit import. Okay, so there we have our new, there we go, new base color. copy this mask, paste into this mask, and then drop that right here. And I'm going to remove those lower flames. Let's go do that just inside Photoshop. Okay. So right here, oh, cancel that. I'm just going to paint that out like so. La da dee dee dee. Paint, paint, paint. Here we go. Here we go. And now if we save that, should be able to come back into Substance. Go here and right click and hit reload. And if it doesn't refresh out here in the view, I'll just drag that back onto it. Yeah, I think I still need to paint out a little bit. So let's add some paint onto that mask. Let's add some paint onto that mask too. Let's turn that texture resolution up. Oh, it's bogging down on me. Okay. So let's kill the paint we had originally in here and kill the paint that we have right there. Let's turn this back on. There we go. That's what I'm looking for. That is what I'm looking for. Okay, cool. So let's turn on our hatch. Okay. And then with the hatch, I think I'm just going to add a straight up paint layer like that. We got everything. We've got just color on there. And I do want to copy that mask, add a mask, and then paste into the mask. And so now we can paint all over that. And then let's select some of that hot yellow right there. And then let's change the hardness of this brush, make it very, very soft. And there we go. All right. Now the last thing I like to do before I start outputting textures is just kind of check things at a higher resolution. So let's turn that one up. Let's turn on our engine, our interior, make sure everything's turned on so we can see it all together. Now let's turn up our environment opacity. Turn on some shadows. and then turn on some anti-aliasing and some of our post effects so that we see something that looks a little closer to a really rendered image. And I highly recommend checking things with different color profiles loaded. That way you can see how all that stuff's going to interact with different setups that you might use. A lot of that stuff is analogous to things you find in your render settings in iRay. Okay. So now that we have all of that in place, it's time to save out our textures. So let's go to File, Export Textures, and let's take a look and see what we get. Okay, it's going to have our texture set name and our model name. Okay, so the model is called ATW, and then our texture set is named over here. We named those. And so the default settings now, you could see right here, they call, let's see, we're in PBR Metal Rough. So right here, the mesh name is the name of the model that you brought in, and then texture set is whatever name you plug in here, and then it's appended this way. This is awesome. I love the way that this works. I love that they've changed this now in the most recent build so that we can have naming there, because now all of that stuff goes into place and you get nice, tight, effective, names that make sense on everything. So let's take, we actually don't want all of these. Let's take the console out, the interior out, and the engine out. And now let's change the hatch, hull, and legs to 4096. Change those to JPEG. And right here, this may seem a little weird where it says common padding and then that has dilation. What that is, the dilation on padding is sometimes you'll hear it called overpaint, and it's how much a texture paints out past your UV shells. So that's all that is, okay? So where it says common padding, we're going to have that all of our UV shells padded by a value assigned right here. So let's set that to dilation plus transparent, and I'm going to have that by 8 pixels past the edge of my UV shells. Okay. And oh, I did not mean to send that there. I don't want those all going there. I did not mean to hit enter. I'm sorry. We'll give that just a second. It won't take it long, and then we'll actually save those out to the right destination. The beauties of doing this stuff live in front of people. You get to see it warts and all. So we'll give that just a minute. So while that's saving out, rather than resaving it out, I'll just go move those files to where they need to be in the end, and we'll be passing these over to Miss Terry when this is all over with, so that we can, so you guys can have another pretty nifty little freebie set of textures to go with the ATW. But that is going to bring us to a close for today. So I hope that we've been able to kind of share some really cool stuff with you guys about painting and texturing and all that kind of stuff. Really focusing back on Substance Painter for a while, because it is such a powerful program, and at at $20 a month, I really dig it. I think that's just great bang for your buck. So anyway, thanks as always to CGBytes and the good folks there for putting these things together, and to Miss Terry and Mr. Jason, 3D Loki, for hanging out in the chat and moderating everything. Thanks as always to all the good folks for coming out and hanging with us, watching this stuff. Hope you guys pick up some cool tips and tricks from this, and can't wait to see you making more cool stuff. So until next time, I am Les from 6S1, and we are out.